History has a way of asking questions we can never truly answer, but sometimes those questions reveal just how fragile the past really was. Imagine for a moment if the native tribes of North America, hundreds of nations, each with their own lands, traditions, and leaders, had put aside centuries of rivalry and suspicion to unite against the tide of settlers pouring west. Imagine if, instead of fractured resistance, they had formed one powerful confederation, stretching from the Great Plains to the deserts of the Southwest, from the forests of the Great Lakes to the mountains of the Rockies. What would the fate of the frontier have been if the tribes had stood together as one? It is easy to forget now, with history written by those who ultimately prevailed, just how many times the balance could have tipped. For centuries before the first wagon wheels creaked across the prairies, native tribes controlled nearly every corner of the continent. Their knowledge of the land was unmatched, their ways of survival perfectly adapted to environments settlers barely understood. They knew which rivers to follow, which passes to avoid, which animals would provide food through the hardest winters. They were not relics of a vanishing world. They were nations, proud and strong, with systems of government, trade networks, and spiritual traditions older than Europe's monarchies. But when settlers came, they did not come as a trickle. They came in waves, each one heavier than the last. At first they built forts and trading posts, small outposts in a vast wilderness. But soon those forts became towns, towns became cities, and cities pushed relentlessly westward, swallowing more land each year. Tribes resisted, but they resisted alone. Some fought bitter wars to defend their hunting grounds. Others tried to negotiate peace. Still others sought to adapt by trading, farming, or converting. Yet all the while they stood divided. Sioux against Crow, Apache against Navajo, Cheyenne against Pawnee. And it was those divisions that settlers and soldiers exploited, promising friendship to one tribe while arming another, making peace with one nation while preparing to push another off its land. But what if, just once, those divisions had been set aside? What if Sitting Bull had sat across the fire from Geronimo? What if Tecumseh's vision of a great native confederacy had taken root and spread across the land? What if the Lakota, the Apache, the Comanche, the Iroquois, and the countless other nations had looked beyond their rivalries and seen the greater threat bearing down upon them? The first thing to imagine is just how strong such a confederation could have been. Consider the Comanche alone, whose mastery of horse warfare made them the terror of the southern plains. Mounted warriors who could loose arrows faster than soldiers could reload muskets, who could strike a column of settlers and vanish into the prairie before reinforcements arrived. Now combine that with the strategic brilliance of the Iroquois Confederacy, who had held sway over the Northeast for centuries through diplomacy as much as warfare. Add in the sheer numbers of the Sioux, the guerrilla tactics of the Apache, the agricultural might of the Cherokee and Creek. Separate, they were formidable. United, they could have formed an empire stretching across half the continent. For settlers, it would have changed everything. The push west would have been far slower, perhaps halted altogether. Wagon trains that once cut across open plains under the thin protection of a few soldiers would have faced organized armies of native warriors, thousands strong, armed not just with bows and rifles, but with unity of purpose. Forts that once stood as lonely outposts of civilization would have been besieged and burned. Towns that once sprouted like weeds along the frontier might never have taken root at all. Even the U.S. Army, hardened as it was by civil war and expansion, would have faced an enemy unlike any it had known. Guerrilla tactics combined with knowledge of the land would have made campaigns costly and slow. Victories that were once taken for granted, like the swift defeat of small tribes pushed onto reservations, would have become drawn-out wars, draining the nation's resources. Washington might have thought twice about sending soldiers west in such numbers when the country was still healing from its own wounds. But beyond the battlefield, the greatest power of a united native front would have been psychological. For centuries, settlers relied on the idea that native tribes were doomed, that they were fractured, destined to fade before the march of progress. A confederation would have shattered that illusion. Imagine newspapers in New York and Philadelphia reporting not on scattered uprisings, but on an entire army of native nations moving as one, signing treaties as one, demanding recognition as one. Public opinion might have shifted. Foreign powers, Britain, France, Spain, might have seen opportunity in supporting this united front, just as they once had during earlier wars. The dream of manifest destiny The belief that America's expansion westward was inevitable might have cracked under the weight of resistance too strong to ignore. Of course, history tells us why it did not happen. Old rivalries ran deep and trust was hard to build. For many tribes, survival meant playing one side against the other, making peace where they could, fighting where they must. And the distances were vast, the cultures so different, the languages so many. To imagine all tribes as one is to imagine a unity that even the United States itself struggled to achieve. But still the possibility lingers, a ghost of a future that never came to pass. For some, the idea of a native confederation is not just speculation. It is a reminder of how close it came to being real. Tecumseh, the great Shawnee leader, nearly built such a union in the early 1800s, rallying tribes from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi. His dream fell with him at the Battle of the Thames, but for a time it showed what might have been. Had his vision spread further, had others carried the torch, the frontier might have been written in entirely different ink. And when you look at the wars that did happen, the Sioux crushing Custer at Little Bighorn, the Apache evading armies for decades in the Southwest, the Seminoles resisting removal in the Florida swamps, you see flashes of what united resistance could achieve. Each of those battles was fought by small nations standing alone. Imagine if they had stood together. Imagine if Custer had ridden not against a few thousand Sioux and Cheyenne, but against tens of thousands drawn from every corner of the continent. His defeat would not have been a battle remembered in history books. It would have been a war that shook the foundation of a nation. And so the question remains, not just as a curiosity of history, but as a haunting reminder of what was lost. What if the native tribes had united? What if the land had remained theirs, defended by a confederation too strong to be broken, too wise to be divided? Would the frontier still have opened? Would the United States look the same today? Or would we live in a country shaped by two civilizations standing side by side, one born of Europe, the other born of the land itself? That is the story we will explore, not as history written in stone, but as history imagined. A tale of what might have been if only the tribes of the Old West had stood together as one. If we allow ourselves to imagine this alternate frontier, the next question is not whether such a union of native tribes could have existed, but how it might have fought, how it might have reshaped the very fabric of American expansion. To understand that, we need to step into the shoes of those who would have lived it, the settlers moving west, the soldiers stationed in far-flung outposts, and the tribal leaders who might have stood shoulder to shoulder under one banner. Picture a wagon train creaking along the Oregon Trail in the 1840s. In our history, the danger came from small bands of warriors defending their lands, skirmishes along the trail, the occasional attack that made settlers fearful but did not halt the march west. In this imagined world, though, the wagons face something far more organized. Scouts report not scattered raiders, but entire war parties waiting along ridges, signaling one another with smoke and mirrors, moving in patterns designed not to harass but to annihilate. 100 wagons rolling westward might never make it past the Platte River. Survivors would turn back east, carrying tales of armies too vast to face. Suddenly, the dream of free land and opportunity beyond the Mississippi would come with the shadow of near-certain death. For the U.S. military, the frontier would shift from expansion to defense. Instead of dispatching a handful of cavalry units to scatter a small band of warriors, the army might find itself mustering entire regiments, just as they had in the Civil War, to march into territory where the enemy knew every canyon, every bluff, every waterhole. And unlike European armies, which often clashed head-on in open fields, this confederation would fight on its own terms. Swift horsemen of the Comanche and Lakota, sharpshooters from the forests of the Northeast, ambushes from Apache fighters in desert passes combined, they would make the land itself a weapon. The political repercussions would have been immense. Every frontier state, from Missouri to Texas, would cry out for protection. The promise of manifest destiny, that shining idea that America was destined to stretch from sea to sea, would dim beneath the reality of a war that might never be won. Congress would face heated debates. Could the nation afford to bleed men and money into a conflict with no clear end? Would settlers continue to pour west if each step carried the weight of near-certain resistance? The government might have been forced into negotiations, treaties that recognized a permanent native confederation as a sovereign nation, much like the European powers of the day. Now think about the international stage. Britain, licking its wounds after losing the War of 1812, still had influence in Canada. France, though diminished in North America, watched the continent with interest. Mexico, still fighting its own wars, had a vested interest in halting U.S. expansion northward. Any of these powers might have seen the Confederation as a valuable ally. Muskets, rifles, and cannons might have been traded for alliances, just as European nations once supported the American Revolution. Suddenly, what settlers saw as a frontier might have transformed into an international conflict, with native warriors wielding not just bows and rifles, but artillery supplied by foreign hands. Even within the United States, the ripple effects would have been staggering. The Civil War, which tore the nation apart in the 1860s, might have played out differently if vast military resources were tied up in endless wars on the frontier. Perhaps the Confederacy would have found allies among tribes determined to weaken the Union. Perhaps the Union itself would have offered greater concessions to native leaders in exchange for support against Southern secession. History bends in countless directions once you consider the possibility of a united native front. But warfare is only part of the story. What truly matters is how unity would have reshaped culture and survival. Imagine a council fire where leaders of the Lakota, Apache, Cherokee, Comanche, Iroquois, and dozens of others gathered not as enemies, but as brothers. Each tribe brought its own strengths: agriculture, horsemanship, diplomacy, spiritual traditions. Combined, they could have created a society capable not only of resisting expansion, but of thriving in the face of it. Trading networks that once spanned regions might have stretched across the continent, fortified by unity rather than fractured by conflict. Knowledge of the land, passed from generation to generation, might have become the backbone of a civilization strong enough to rival the young United States itself. Consider, too, the settlers themselves, many of whom were not soldiers or politicians, but farmers, families, and dreamers chasing a better life. For them, the image of the frontier was tied to opportunity land for the taking, fields waiting to be plowed, towns waiting to be built. But what if every town beyond the Mississippi faced immediate organized resistance? What if every attempt to stake a claim met with the knowledge that the land was not unclaimed, not empty, but fiercely defended by a nation of nations? Perhaps the flood of settlers would have slowed to a trickle. Perhaps immigration from Europe, so vital to America's growth, would have diverted elsewhere to Canada, to South America, to other colonies where the promise of land was more certain. The demographic map of North America might look entirely different today, and the cultural impact cannot be ignored. Instead of being pushed onto reservations, stripped of languages and traditions, native tribes might have preserved their way of life on their own terms. We might speak today of a dual America, one shaped by settlers and industry, the other by native traditions and stewardship of the land. The stories of the Old West would not be tales of cowboys and outlaws pushing into open country, but of uneasy coexistence, of negotiations between equals, of two civilizations learning to share a vast continent. The myth of the lone pioneer might never have taken root. Instead, the central myth of America could have been one of balance, of compromise, of respect born not of charity, but of necessity. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this vision lies in the moments when it almost came true. Tecumseh's dream of a confederation cut short before its time. The alliances that briefly flared during the wars of removal, when tribes recognized the greater danger too late. The victories, like Little Bighorn, where united resistance brought down even the most arrogant of generals. Each of these moments hints at the future that might have been, a glimpse of a road untaken. It shows us that unity was not impossible, only unfulfilled. And so, when we ask what might have happened if native tribes had united, we are not only asking about a military campaign or a shift in politics. We are asking about the soul of a nation, about what America might look like if its foundation had been built on shared respect rather than conquest. Would the cities of the West still stand where they do today? Would the railroad still stretch from ocean to ocean? Would the stars on the flag still number 50? Or would they have stopped at the Mississippi, leaving the West as the sovereign domain of a native empire? It is impossible to know for certain. But the very act of imagining forces us to reckon with how close the world came to being different, how fragile the balance of history truly was. One more leader like Tecumseh, one more victory like Little Bighorn, one more alliance across old rivalries in the frontier might have been written, not as a tale of conquest but as a tale of resistance, unity, and survival. If we carry this vision further, beyond the initial battles and the desperate years of resistance, the real intrigue lies in the long term. What kind of America would have emerged if the native tribes had stood together and carved out their own sovereign place on the continent? Would there have been two nations side by side, one born of Europe's colonies and one rooted in the soil of the land itself? Or would there have been a constant simmering conflict that never truly ended? To imagine it is to step into an alternate history where every detail of the present feels just slightly unfamiliar. Think of the railroads, those iron arteries that tied the young nation together and allowed settlers to flood into the West. In our history, they cut across tribal lands with little regard, backed by soldiers and lawmen who forced compliance at gunpoint. But in a world where tribes had united, laying those rails would not have been so simple. Every mile of track would have been contested, every train a potential target for raids. Investors in the East, already wary of the dangers of frontier projects, might have hesitated. Without the railroad, the rush to California's gold, the birth of boomtowns like Denver and San Francisco, even the rise of western cattle towns like Dodge City and Abilene, might have been slowed by decades. The Old West as we know it, a land of rapid expansion, gold rushes, cattle drives, and gunfights might never have unfolded in the same feverish way. And if the railroads stalled, so too would America's claim to being a continental power. Without swift movement west, without the ability to transport goods, soldiers, and settlers across vast distances, the United States might have remained a country centered east of the Mississippi, looking inward rather than outward. The Pacific coast, sparsely settled and far from the centers of power, might have become its own separate sphere, perhaps even dominated by foreign powers, with Britain expanding south from Canada or Mexico, holding more firmly onto California and the Southwest. Within the lands of the Confederation, life might have taken a different path altogether. Free from the constant pressure of removal and assimilation, tribes would have had the chance to evolve on their own terms. The Cherokee, who had already adopted aspects of European-style government and even written language under Sequoia, might have become the architects of a blended society, mixing traditions of the old with innovations of the new. The horse culture of the plains, dominated by the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche, might have thrived for generations longer, preserving the great buffalo herds that were nearly exterminated in our history. The agricultural traditions of the Iroquois and Creek could have expanded into larger-scale farming, sustaining growing populations. Instead of being forced onto reservations, stripped of language and culture, native nations might have built schools, towns, and cities infused with their own values and traditions. Culturally, the impact would have been profound. Instead of a United States built largely on European ideals of property, industry, and expansion, there might have been an enduring counterbalance, a civilization that valued land as sacred, that treated resources with reverence, that placed community above individual profit. The clash between these two philosophies would have shaped not only politics but the very soul of the nation. Imagine debates in Congress where native representatives stood alongside settlers, arguing not from the margins but from equal footing. Imagine treaties that weren't hollow promises but real agreements between sovereign powers. Imagine a national identity not built on the erasure of native voices, but on the coexistence of two great traditions. Of course, such a coexistence would not have been without tension. A confederation of tribes, vast and diverse, would have faced its own challenges. Old rivalries would have lurked beneath the surface. Disagreements over leadership, over alliances, over how much to adapt to the modern world. There would have been pressures from settlers desperate for land, from foreign powers eager to manipulate. Wars might still have erupted, treaties might still have been tested, but the balance of power would have been different, no longer a story of conquest, but of negotiation, of give and take. And if we look further ahead to the 20th century, the implications grow even more staggering. Would the United States have become the industrial giant it did without full access to the resources of the West, the gold, the silver, the timber, the fertile plains? Would cities like Los Angeles and Seattle even exist in their current form? Or would they have remained small outposts at the edge of a native empire? Perhaps America would have turned its ambitions outward sooner, seeking influence overseas to compensate for limits at home. Perhaps the great wars of the 20th century would have played out differently, with a divided North America unable to project the same unified power abroad. And within the Confederation itself, modernization might have taken on a unique form. Native leaders, aware of the power of industry and technology, might have sought to harness it without abandoning their traditions. Factories built not to consume endlessly, but to sustain communities. Railroads laid not to carve up sacred lands, but to connect nations. Schools where children learned both their ancestral languages and the tools of the modern world. A balance that in our history was shattered by force might have become, in this alternate history, a living example of how two worlds could coexist. It is tempting to think this vision is too romantic, too idealized. After all, even among settlers, unity was fragile, marred by civil wars, political disputes, and economic greed. Could a confederation of such diverse tribes have truly held together? Could leaders with such different traditions have agreed on a common future? Perhaps not. But history is filled with unlikely unions. The 13 colonies that became the United States were once bitter rivals, divided by geography and culture. Yet they came together in the face of a greater threat. If it was possible for them, why not for the tribes whose very survival depended on it? What is certain is that the world would look nothing like it does today. The stories we tell of the Old West, the myths of cowboys and pioneers, might never have taken root. Instead, our movies, our novels, our history books might be filled with tales of native statesmen and warriors, of councils where the future of the continent was debated between equals. The great American identity so tied to expansion, to manifest destiny, to the belief that the land was there for the taking, might never have existed in the same form. Instead, we might see America as a place of balance, a land defined not by conquest, but by coexistence, not by erasure, but by endurance. And perhaps the most haunting question of all is not whether such a future was possible, but what we lost when it did not happen. The buffalo herds that thundered across the plains, gone. The languages, thousands of them, silenced. The traditions, the songs, the ways of life nearly extinguished. A confederation might have preserved them, kept them alive, passed them down into the present, not as fragments, but as thriving traditions. Our world would not only look different, it would feel different, shaped by voices that were silenced before their stories could fully be told. When we reach the end of this thought experiment, this journey into the shadows of what might have been, we're left not just with a different picture of history, but with a mirror reflecting our own world. To imagine the native tribes of North America united against settlers is to peel back the thin layer of inevitability we've been taught, to see that history was never guaranteed. Every decision, every battle, every alliance shaped the frontier in ways that might easily have turned another direction. Think back to the flashpoints of history, the War of 1812, when Tecumseh nearly built his confederation, only to have it fall apart with his death. The California gold rush, when tens of thousands surged west in a single decade, overwhelming tribes fractured and unprepared. The Civil War, when the United States was at its weakest, torn apart from within. In each of those moments, a united native confederation might have tipped the scales. A war won, a rush slowed, an alliance forged. Instead of being scattered and silenced, native nations might have stood as a living power, their voices shaping the destiny of the continent. But because that unity never fully came to pass, the history we know is one of displacement, of broken treaties, of cultures nearly wiped out. Reservations were drawn, languages forbidden, traditions outlawed. The United States fulfilled its dream of manifest destiny, stretching from sea to sea, while native nations were forced to the margins. And so, when we imagine what might have been, it is not only a story of military strategy or political maneuvering, it is a story of survival, of what could have been preserved if unity had been found. Picture the land itself. The vast herds of buffalo that once covered the plains like a living tide. In our history, they were hunted nearly to extinction, a deliberate strategy to starve the plains tribes into submission. In a world where those tribes stood united, the herds might have endured, protected as sacred, sustaining generations. The prairies might still echo with the sound of hooves and the songs of hunters who saw themselves not as masters of the land, but as part of its living spirit. The great forests of the East, stripped bare in our history for timber and farmland, might have been guarded more carefully, treated as something more than fuel for expansion. Rivers might have flowed free, unchoked by dams, carrying salmon and sturgeon in numbers unimaginable today. And in the cities of the modern world, perhaps we would see something else too, not just steel and glass, not just highways and skyscrapers, but architecture rooted in harmony with the land. Ceremonial lodges beside courthouses. Sacred grounds preserved within the heart of bustling metropolises. Languages spoken freely, woven into law and song, not as relics of the past but as living tongues shaping the future. The very idea of what it means to be American might have been different, less about conquering, more about coexisting. But the truth of history is not always so kind. Division, greed, and the relentless push of settlers shattered the chance for unity. Some tribes fought fiercely, others sought peace, still others tried to adapt, but all were forced into the same fate: to yield ground, to give up lands, to sign treaties that rarely lasted longer than the ink it took to write them. It is a tragedy of what might have been, but also a lesson that echoes even now. Because the story of native unity, though it did not reshape the frontier as it might have, did not vanish entirely. In every tribe that resisted, in every leader who dreamed of confederation, there is a spark of what was possible. Tecumseh's vision, Sitting Bull's defiance, Geronimo's resilience each carried the spirit of unity, if only for a moment. And today, as native voices rise once again to reclaim languages, traditions, and lands, that spirit still lingers. It reminds us that history is not a straight road, but a series of crossroads, and the paths we take or fail to take define everything that comes after. So what if the tribes had united? Perhaps the United States would be smaller, its power diminished, its history rewritten. Perhaps the West would be a sovereign native empire, standing alongside the U.S. as a separate nation. Perhaps there would be no Wild West as we know it, no cattle towns, no gold rushes, no cowboy legends, because the frontier itself would never have opened in the same way. Or perhaps coexistence would have come sooner, forced not by guilt or hindsight, but by necessity, by respect earned on the battlefield and at the council table. We can never know for certain. History chose one path, and the world we live in today is the result of that choice. But in the act of imagining, we see the truth more clearly. The frontier was not inevitable. The displacement of native nations was not destiny. It was choices made by leaders, by settlers, by soldiers. And in the flicker of imagination, we glimpse the choices that were never made, the alliances that never formed, the futures that slipped away. And maybe that's the power of stories like this. They force us to confront not only what happened, but what might have been. They remind us that history is written by the victors, but it is shaped by countless possibilities, most of which never see the light of day. They give us the chance, however briefly, to honor those possibilities, to remember that another world was possible, a world where the tribes of the frontier stood as one, and the course of a nation was forever changed. So as you walk through the world today, in cities built on lands once sacred, on highways carved through hunting grounds, on farms plowed from prairies that once thundered with buffalo, pause for a moment and think of that question. What if? What if the native tribes had united? What if history had bent another way? And what does it mean that it did not? Because sometimes the stories we imagine tell us as much about who we are as the stories we know. And in the shadows of those stories, in the spaces between what was and what might have been, we find the echoes of a world lost, and the reminder that history, fragile and uncertain, is never as inevitable as it seems.